The richest brother and sister duo that quietly dominates Virginia, that's exactly what we're getting into right now. All right, picture Virginia for a second. Not just horse country, Washington spillover, colonial imagery, and old money neighborhoods. Picture the real state, McLean boardrooms, sprawling estates hidden behind tree lines, private fortunes that do not need loud branding because the institutions around them already understand the signal. Huge companies that sit close to power without ever needing to campaign for attention. And when you start asking which brother and sister duo best fits the idea of quietly dominating Virginia, one answer rises above almost everybody else: Jacqueline Mars and John Mars. What makes this topic so strong is not simply that they are rich. It is that their family's empire is woven into one of the largest privately held companies in America, rooted in Virginia, protected by secrecy, and large enough to make most public billionaires look almost noisy by comparison. These are not just wealthy siblings. These are siblings attached to a fortune so massive, so disciplined, and so structurally embedded that Virginia power starts looking incomplete without the Mars name somewhere in the background. Virginia has no shortage of serious money. Carlisle money, defense-adjacent money, finance money, old family money, founder money, political money. But the Mars siblings sit in a category that feels different. Jacqueline Mars has long been recognized as the richest person in Virginia, and John Mars sits in the same rarefied atmosphere of inherited private wealth, both tied to the same family company. That already makes the pair formidable. But the real reason they fit this topic is the nature of the business behind the fortune. Mars is not some flashy tech boom story or a temporary financial surge. It is a multi-generational, privately controlled, globally dominant consumer empire built on things ordinary people buy without ever considering the magnitude of the machine behind them. Candy, pet care, food, snacks, household brands that feel familiar, even innocent, while the ownership structure behind them remains one of the most secretive and powerful in the country. Another reason the Mars siblings are such a compelling answer is that the underlying family empire does not begin with the usual prestige imagery people associate with giant fortunes. It starts with candy making, kitchen labor, product discipline, manufacturing, branding, scale, distribution. The family story reaches back through Frank Mars and then through Forrest Mars Sr., eventually creating the business structure that Jacqueline, John, and their late brother inherited. That matters, because even though Jacqueline and John are heirs, the empire they sit atop was not born as a financial abstraction. It was built through product obsession and expansion over time. And the genius of the Mars story is that it transforms something small, familiar, and almost childlike into a corporate machine of enormous seriousness. Once a family proves it can build that kind of machine and still keep control private across generations, the power becomes harder to penetrate. This is one of the deepest truths in American wealth. The most formidable empires often sell things that seem comforting, even harmless. Chocolate bars, candy-coated pieces, pet food, pantry staples, products that sit in checkout aisles and kitchen cabinets without anyone imagining the dynastic force behind them. Mars mastered that dynamic better than almost anybody. Its brands became intimate parts of daily life. Millions of people know the products. Very few could explain the scale of the private ownership structure or the level of wealth concentrated in the family behind it. That disconnect is where the power lives. When a company can become globally familiar while its owners remain personally obscure, it gains a huge advantage. Public scrutiny falls on the brands, not the bloodline. Attention goes to taste, advertising, and shelf space, not to the family machine that keeps collecting the rewards. Jacqueline and John Mars inherited one of the cleanest versions of that advantage in the world. This is where the scale becomes almost absurd. Mars is not merely a candy company that got lucky. It grew into an enormous private corporation spanning confectionery, pet care, food, and major global consumer operations. It is long ranked among the biggest private companies in America, And in Virginia, it has stood as the kind of corporate presence that quietly dwarfs most conventional business success stories. The size matters, but so does the structure. A huge public company can be pressured, second-guessed, and made performative by markets. A huge private company with deeply entrenched family ownership operates differently. It moves with patience. It chooses opacity. It can think generationally. It can acquire aggressively when the moment is right. It can decide that visibility itself is optional. And that is exactly the sort of structure that produces the kind of soft but overwhelming dominance this topic is about. And this is where the state itself becomes part of the story. Virginia is one of the best possible places in America for this kind of family influence to mature quietly. It sits near Washington without being swallowed by Washington. It contains wealth, prestige, bureaucracy, old landed symbolism, and modern corporate seriousness all at once. A family like the Marses does not need the glare of New York or Los Angeles. In some ways, those places would be less useful. Virginia offers proximity to national power with more privacy, more land, more insulation, and a stronger culture of elite discretion. McLean in particular has long been one of those places where serious money can exist behind calm facades. A gigantic private company based there feels less like an anomaly and more like a perfect fit. Of the two siblings, Jacqueline Mars has often been the most publicly legible because she is so frequently named as Virginia's richest resident. That matters. Once one sibling becomes a shorthand for statewide wealth, the family's place in the public imagination sharpens. But Jacqueline's significance is not just that she is rich. It is that she personifies a much larger structure while still preserving the family's instinct for privacy. She worked in the company, served on the board, and remained part of the visible lineage of ownership without turning herself into a celebrity billionaire brand. That balance is powerful. Public enough to symbolize authority, private enough to avoid dilution. In elite life, that is often the sweet spot. And then there is John Mars, whose very privacy strengthens the brother and sister framing. John is a reminder that the Mars fortune is not a one-person phenomenon wearing a family name like decoration. It is genuinely shared across sibling lines, and that makes the whole thing feel more dynastic. He has been linked to the same immense ownership stake, the same corporate inheritance, and the same family system of restraint and discretion. If Jacqueline is the slightly more visible symbol, John is part of what makes the system feel uncrackable. The pair together suggests continuity, not personality cult. They do not need one sibling to become a mogul celebrity because the structure itself is already overwhelming. That is why the brother and sister duo angle works so well. This is important. Some rich families dominate a state through constant media involvement, political combat, or public lifestyle theater. The Mars style is the opposite. Their force comes from ownership. Ownership of the company, ownership of the fortune, ownership of the long-term strategic direction, ownership of privacy itself. That kind of dominance is usually more durable than the louder versions because it does not depend on popularity cycles. It does not need applause. It does not need mass affection. The public can forget the family for months at a time and still keep feeding the empire through everyday consumption. That is an extraordinary advantage. Jacqueline and John Mars do not need to stay in front of the culture to keep winning from it. A lot of coverage treats Mars family privacy like an interesting personality trait. It is more than that. It is one of the family's strongest strategic assets. Private ownership plus cultural familiarity plus personal obscurity is an incredibly effective formula. Secrecy limits unnecessary scrutiny. It protects internal decision-making. It reduces the chances of the family becoming a public morality play. It keeps competitors, media, and political actors at a distance from the personal lives of the owners. Most importantly, it preserves the psychological gravity of the family. People know the wealth is enormous, but because the owners are so rarely overexposed, the magnitude remains somewhat mythic. That helps a family dominate quietly. Mystery creates its own authority. When people hear domination, They sometimes imagine direct political rule or constant public control. But in places like Virginia, elite dominance often works more subtly. Corporate headquarters, philanthropic ties, estate presence, social prestige, economic weight, cultural symbolism, all of those channels matter. The Mars name carries that kind of layered force. The family's presence in Virginia is not just about where the company is based. It is about what the company represents in the state. One of the largest private enterprises in America anchored in Virginia. That alone creates gravity. Add to that the family's wealth, its long-standing elite status, and the quiet aura surrounding its members. And the result is a brother and sister duo whose dominance feels embedded rather than advertised. Virginia does not need them on television every day to understand the scale of their position. That is another advantage. Everybody understands candy. Everybody understands pet food. Everybody understands packaged brands. The categories feel ordinary. And ordinary things, when sold at massive global scale under private control, become extraordinary wealth engines, precisely because people underestimate them. Mars did not have to convince the world to adopt some futuristic behavior. It had to become part of existing human habit: snacking, treating, buying for pets, and grabbing something familiar at the store. Once a family owns habit at global scale, it owns something more stable than trend. Jacqueline and John Mars dominate Virginia, in part because the fortune beneath them comes from routine behavior repeated by millions of people every day. There is almost nothing more powerful than that. This is one of the major differences between the Mars siblings and other power figures. They did not need to become governors, senators, or media stars to command presence. Their style is more old line than that. Build the company, keep it private, preserve the family line, remain respected, let the scale speak. In a place like Virginia, that method can be even more effective than direct political visibility. Corporate weight creates policy relevance even without loud ideological branding. A family tied to one of the state's biggest private companies does not have to perform influence for everyone to know it exists. That kind of indirect power can be stronger because it does not depend on elections or public approval. Jacqueline and John Mars feel dominant precisely because their authority sits above the noise rather than inside it. Virginia has always had an elite culture that values polish, understatement, and controlled presentation. Even when power is massive, it often prefers to look composed. The Mars siblings fit that temperament almost perfectly. The family does not sell itself like a new money spectacle. It does not constantly narrate its own greatness. It simply exists at a level of wealth and influence that makes explanation almost unnecessary. That alignment with the state's elite temperament matters. It makes their dominance feel natural to the landscape rather than imported from somewhere louder. Some families feel rich in Virginia. The Mars siblings feel built into it. One of the reasons this duo feels so overwhelming is that the Mars fortune did not freeze in some nostalgic era of candy bar success. The company kept evolving. It expanded across categories, deepened its global footprint, and kept using the freedoms of private ownership to make enormous strategic moves. That matters, because it shows this is not a decaying inheritance being passively protected by descendants. It is an inheritance attached to a living giant. When a family remains this rich while the underlying company keeps growing, the siblings start to feel less like heirs and more like custodians of a private state. The world keeps changing. Public companies rise and fall, tech fortunes explode and wobble, yet Mars continues to stand there, huge and disciplined, with Jacqueline and John connected to the ownership line at the top. That kind of continuity is one of the strongest forms of dominance a state can host. That is another very Virginia aspect of the story. Plenty of rich families want everyone to know they are powerful. The Mars siblings do not seem to need that performance. Their company sits near the national capital, their wealth is immense, their name carries social and economic gravity, and yet their style has remained largely insulated from the kind of public peacocking that usually weakens elite mystique. They do not have to shout because the setting already amplifies them. In Northern Virginia especially, there is a whole culture of influence that prefers the expensive, quiet room to the loud stage. Mars fits that ecosystem beautifully. The sibling duo feels dominant precisely because it appears above the scramble. While other fortunes spend energy trying to look important, the Mars fortune has long operated from the assumption that importance is already settled. Most people hear the Mars name and think of candy first. That is understandable, but it is also part of the illusion. The real empire stretches into pet care, food systems, global manufacturing, acquisitions, and large-scale corporate governance. That breadth matters because it means the siblings' influence is not tied to one nostalgic brand memory. It sits across multiple stable sectors of consumption. In other words, the fortune is broader, sturdier, and more diversified than the casual public imagination allows. And when a brother and sister duo is tied to a family company that broad, their dominance stops looking like a quirky confectionery story and starts looking like something closer to a private consumer goods kingdom. Virginia is not just hosting a candy fortune. It is hosting one of the deepest pools of private family capital in the country, and Jacqueline and John Mars sit at the heart of it. That may be the most remarkable part of the whole thing. In a country obsessed with billionaire performance, the Mars siblings still became legendary without acting like performers. No cult of personality, no constant interviews, no desperate social media empire building, no attempt to become folk heroes of entrepreneurship. The family's legend grew through controlled absence and overwhelming scale. That creates a different emotional effect. Instead of familiarity, the public gets distance. Instead of intimacy, it gets myth. And myth is often more durable than popularity. Jacqueline and John Mars feel like the kind of figures who sit above normal state rankings because their fortune belongs to a different altitude altogether. A brother and sister duo can feel temporary if it depends too much on media attention or on one active role. The Mars siblings feel stronger because they represent continuity. They are not just rich siblings occupying the same moment. They are the continuation of a family ownership line that kept one of America's greatest private empires under close control. Their significance is not episodic, it is structural. They embody the transfer of dynastic power across generations while keeping the core intact. That is what makes their presence in Virginia feel so complete. They are not just wealthy people in the state. They are proof that one family system has remained atop the state's private wealth order for an astonishingly long time. And that is the real key. Quiet domination does not mean every person in Virginia is talking about Jacqueline and John Mars over dinner. It means that when you map serious private wealth, institutional gravity, elite symbolism, and corporate scale inside the state, their family keeps appearing at the top. The company is huge. The ownership is concentrated, the privacy is disciplined, the prestige is entrenched, the geography is perfect for discretion, the products are globally familiar. The family itself remains just distant enough to keep the entire structure feeling more powerful, not less. That is what domination looks like when it has nothing to prove. So, let's land this. The richest brother and sister duo that quietly dominates Virginia is Jacqueline Mars and John Mars, because they sit atop one of the largest private corporate fortunes in America, keep that fortune anchored in Virginia through the Mars empire, preserve the family's strategic privacy, and embody a form of elite control so polished and so deeply rooted that the state's highest levels of private wealth seem to bend naturally around them. That is the real story, not just a candy inheritance. A brother and sister dynasty whose quiet ownership style turned Virginia into the perfect setting for private power at its most durable.